Most people have a simple way of thinking about the two halves of the Bible. Old Testament, rules, wrath, a God who punishes. New Testament, love, grace, Jesus. It's clean, it's simple, and it's mostly wrong. Because if that's all the difference is, then you're missing the most important story the Bible is actually telling. Today we're going to go deeper, and by the end of this, the way you read both Testaments is going to change. What are the two Testaments? Let's start with the basics. The Old Testament is a collection of 39 books, written mostly in Hebrew, spanning roughly 1,500 years of history. It covers creation, the story of Israel, the law God gave through Moses, poetry, wisdom, literature, and the writings of the prophets. The New Testament is 27 books, written in Greek, over roughly 50 to 60 years. It covers the life of Jesus, the birth of the early church, letters written to Christian communities, and the book of Revelation. Together they form one library, but they're not random, they're telling one connected story. And the word testament is actually the key to understanding how. What does testament actually mean? The word testament comes from the Latin testamentum, which means covenant, a binding agreement. So when you say Old Testament and New Testament, what you're really saying is Old Covenant and New Covenant, and that reframes everything. The Old Covenant was the agreement God made with Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. Follow these laws, live in this land, be my people, and I will be your God. The New Covenant is what Jesus introduces at the Last Supper, and what the New Testament unpacks. It's a new kind of agreement, not written on stone tablets, written as the prophet Jeremiah predicted 600 years earlier on human hearts. So what actually changed? Here's where it gets interesting. A lot of people assume the Old Testament God and the New Testament God are almost different characters. Angry versus loving. Distant versus close. But that reading misses something huge. The Old Testament is full of God's love, mercy, and grace. And the New Testament still takes sin seriously. What changed is not God's character. What changed is the method. In the Old Covenant, the relationship between God and humanity was mediated through a system. Priests, sacrifices, a physical temple, a specific nation. Access to God had structure and distance built into it. In the New Covenant, that changes completely. The letter to the Hebrews spends 11 chapters explaining this. Jesus becomes the final high priest, the final sacrifice. The temple imagery shifts from a building to a person, and then to a community of people. The wall between humanity and God doesn't just get lowered. According to the New Testament, it gets torn down entirely, which is actually why the Gospel accounts record the temple curtain tearing in two the moment Jesus dies on the cross. That curtain separated ordinary people from the holiest place in the temple. Its tearing was not just dramatic, it was theological. If this is the kind of Bible content you've been looking for, honest, deep, and actually makes sense, subscribe and hit the bell. I go this deep on every single video. Now let's keep going. What about the law? This is where most people get confused, and where the rules versus grace framing falls apart. The law in the Old Testament wasn't meant to be a ladder to earn God's approval. Even within the Old Testament itself, figures like Abraham are described as righteous not because of what they did, but because of their faith. Paul makes this argument extensively in his letter to the Romans and Galatians. The law, he says, was never the mechanism of salvation. It was more like a mirror, showing humanity what it was falling short of, and a guardian, pointing forward to something better. Jesus himself says in Matthew 5 that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. That word, fulfill, is doing enormous work. It doesn't mean cancel, it means bring to completion, to be what the law was always pointing toward. So the New Testament isn't a rejection of the Old, it's the Old Testament arriving at its destination. Why this matters, understanding this changes how you read both Testaments. When you read the Old Testament, you stop seeing it as primitive religion that Christianity replaced. You start seeing it as a long, layered story that is actively moving somewhere, with prophecy, pattern, and purpose woven through it. When you read the New Testament, you stop seeing it as a standalone document and start seeing it as a conclusion. Every image Jesus uses, lamb, shepherd, temple, bread, vine, is loaded with Old Testament meaning. Without that background, you're reading in a second language without a dictionary. The two testaments don't contradict each other. One sets the stage. The other brings the main character on. So what really changed between the Old and New Testament? Not God's heart, not the standard, not the story. What changed was the fullness of how that story was told and who it centered on. If this opened up something new for you, there's a lot more where this came from. I'm going deep on the Bible, the history, the theology, the hard questions, in a way that's honest and actually makes sense. Subscribe, and let's keep going.